The morning after the showcase, Daniel arrived early for drop-off. Sophie walked ahead, her backpack bouncing with each step. Clara greeted her with a smile and a gentle touch to her shoulder, then turned back to help a boy struggling to hang his coat. Daniel watched for a moment, then stepped outside for a breath before work. Rachel found him near the sidewalk, perched on the stone edge of the school garden, sipping coffee from a travel mug. She wore red, not a PTA-approved pop of color red. It was a deliberate, unmistakable red. Sharp lipstick, stiletto heels, and a blouse that didn't belong near finger paint. "Good morning," she said brightly. Daniel nodded. "Hey!" Rachel tilted her head, eyes scanning his face like she was reading it for weaknesses. "You know, I always admire a devoted dad. Showing up, being present, it's rare. Just trying to do my part." Daniel gave a polite smile. "More than your part," she said. "Clara seems grateful. You two look comfortable." Rachel's smirk was altogether unpleasant. When Daniel didn't answer, she stepped closer. "You know, if you ever wanted to talk, I'm an excellent listener. PTA meetings can be dreadfully boring, but I find ways to make them interesting." The innuendo wasn't subtle, nor was the shift in her tone, syrupy sweet with a bite underneath. Daniel stood. "Rachel, you don't have to say anything. It's just, some of us know how lonely it can get, especially if you've made mistakes." That struck a nerve, but Daniel didn't show it. He would not give this woman the satisfaction of replying. Never was Daniel struck more by the similarity between this woman and his ex-wife than he was at that moment. "And Clara?" she went on. "She's sweet, but come on. Clara is not exactly at your level, and she's a little attached, don't you think?" That did it. Daniel took a step back, just enough to make the distance intentional, not bothering to hide his annoyance. "You remind me a little too much of my ex-wife," he said evenly. "Women like you are beautiful, calculated, and always trying to frame people like puzzles they can control." Rachel blinked as if taken by surprise. Daniel did not allow her to regain her footing. "I'm not interested, Rachel," he said with no trace of uncertainty. "And I never will be. I dipped my toes in that pool once and almost drowned as a result." Her expression flickered with shock, then fury, then something that might have been humiliation. By the time he walked away, she was already smoothing her hair and adjusting her blouse, recalibrating. It was so like Vanessa that Daniel knew what she would do. Rachel had lost the man, not that she had ever had him. To her, there were other ways to win, other angles to exploit. She would find out Daniel was no easy target, and Clara had a quiet strength about her that women like Rachel could never understand. The letter arrived the following Monday, delivered directly to Principal Franklin, carbon copied to the superintendent and school board. The accusations weren't subtle. They consisted of favoritism, boundary violations, and improper emotional entanglement between teacher and parent. It spoke of a potential conflict of interest that had created discomfort among several families. Franklin called Clara into his office before the first bell. She sat in the familiar chair across from his desk, hands folded in her lap, and listened as he read the complaint aloud. Clara knew he didn't do it to shame or accuse her. He didn't sound angry, just disappointed on her behalf. "I've already spoken with the board rep," he said when he finished. "They want options. The cleanest is to move Sophie into a different class to remove the immediate concern." Clara shook her head, slow and deliberate. "That would be a mistake, Mr. Franklin. Sophie has made actual progress, and she trusts me. Moving her to another class would hurt her and undo all the progress we've made." "I know." "Then what's the other option?" Mr. Franklin sighed, pulling off his glasses and massaging his temples. "A formal investigation. That entails interviews, observation, paperwork, the kind of scrutiny that is damaging even when there is nothing improper." Clara exhaled. "So, I get to choose between hurting my student or proving I'm not something I never was." Franklin leaned forward, his voice softening. "Clara, I believe you, and everyone who works here does. But the board has to protect itself, and Rachel framed this well." Clara nodded. "Of course she did." Mr. Franklin paused, considering her. "You can take a few days if you need them." "No," she said, standing. "I'll teach. It's what I do." Clara didn't cry until the end of the day, She didn't because she felt guilty, because she wasn't. The tears came because she'd done everything right, held the line, protected her student, followed the rules, and still found herself in the crosshairs. Melissa found her in the copy room that afternoon, shoulders tight, wiping at her eyes with the heel of her hand. "I don't want sympathy," Clara said. "Good," Melissa replied, wrapping an arm around her anyway. "Because you won't get it. Instead, you'll get support." "It's the same thing." "Not the way I do it." Clara laughed, just once, then let her head rest against Melissa's shoulder. They stood that way for a long time. No one else came in, but Clara didn't need anything else. Daniel didn't hear about the complaint from Clara. He heard it from Sophie. She'd come home quieter than usual, with no drawings and no bounce in her step. She sat down to dinner without a word and barely touched her lasagna. Halfway through the meal, she asked, "Did I do something wrong again?" Daniel put his fork down. "Why would you think that?" "Because Miss Hayes is sad," Sophie said, not meeting his eyes. "And people keep whispering again." Daniel's stomach sank, clenching with a mix of anger and determination. There was no way Daniel was going to allow Rachel Harwood, of all people, to dictate his life or tear down a woman he thought highly of for nothing more than petty revenge. Thoughts spun in Daniel's head, but he pushed them aside, knowing Sophie needed him first. "Sophie, you have done nothing wrong, and neither has she." "But this happened last time." Sophie's voice was small, like she was trying to make herself tiny enough to avoid notice. "They said things, and now they're saying more." Daniel reached for her hand across the table, warm and trembling. "This isn't your fault. Not now. Not ever." Sophie nodded, but it wasn't belief. It was habit. After she went to bed, Daniel paced the living room for an hour before picking up his phone. This could not be allowed to stand, but Daniel knew he would need to handle it properly. Actions taken in anger could do more damage, so Daniel did not pace in indecision, but in calculation. When he decided what he needed to do, Daniel started with an email to Principal Franklin. In it, he mounted a vigorous defense of Clara's character and actions that was respectful, clear, and firm, while choosing every word with care. "I want to formally state that any perception of impropriety between Miss Hayes and me is being exaggerated. Her conduct has always been professional, her care for the students exemplary, especially for my daughter. She has gone above and beyond to make Sophie feel seen, safe, and supported after a difficult family transition. Any suggestion otherwise is false, and frankly, harmful to the emotional well-being of a child who is learning what it means to trust again." Daniel didn't sign the letter angrily. He closed with nothing more than Daniel Reed, Father, because that was what mattered. That was only the first step. The next day, he reached out to a few other parents he'd come to know, people who respected Clara, who'd watched her in action and trusted her judgment. He asked if they'd be willing to speak up, to write their own letters and balance the record. Most said yes. Daniel didn't tell Clara, not yet. She had enough to carry without wondering who was coming to her defense. But when he passed her in the hallway that week and she offered him the smallest nod, professional but full of pain, he gave her a look that said everything else. "You're not alone. Not in this." The PTA meeting was supposed to be about funding the spring field trip, but everyone knew why the folding chairs filled faster than usual. There were whispers at the coffee table and stiff smiles between certain parents, and Rachel Harwood sat front and center in a pale blue blazer like she was chairing the board of a nonprofit. The reason for the tense atmosphere was not lost on anyone. Clara stood in the back, beside Melissa. She hadn't planned to come, but Franklin had asked her to. "Be visible," he'd said, "but not vocal. Let them speak first." So she waited. The tension was thick as Principal Franklin took his seat and called the meeting to order. Rachel raised her hand almost immediately. "I'd like to revisit the issue of professional boundaries," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "It's come to my attention, and that of others, that there are situations in our classrooms that warrant review." Melissa stood before Franklin could even respond. "Excuse me," she said. Rachel returned a cool look. "You'll have your turn." "I'm taking it now," Melissa said, her tone all honey and steel, "because some of us are tired of sitting through thinly veiled attacks." There was a brief, stunned silence. Melissa turned to the room, her gaze sweeping the rows of parents. I've worked beside Clara Hayes for 3 years. I've watched her carry kids through grief, learning disorders, and family upheaval. She is the first to stay late, the last to ask for praise, and the one person I'd trust with my children without a second thought. A few parents nodded. Rachel's jaw tightened, perhaps sensing her constructed narrative was about to collapse. Another parent stood, a quiet mom from the corner who rarely spoke at these meetings. My son had her last year, she said. He used to cry before school. Now he reads bedtime stories to his little sister. That's what she gave him. More nods. Another parent, this time a dad, added, My twins never liked school before Miss Hayes. Now they beg to go. The room shifted, minute by minute, as other parents offered their support for Clara, the momentum changing. A well of emotion settled in Clara's breast, threatening to bring her to tears. All the while, she looked at Daniel, sitting next to Sophie near the front, a quiet resolution hanging about him like a cloud. Then Clara gasped as she understood. This defense was his doing. The other parents had agreed to support her, but Daniel had organized it. When everyone who wanted to speak in support had their say, Rachel looked to Franklin, but he didn't move to support her. Instead, he stood. I've read the complaint, he said, his voice calm, measured. I've reviewed the context, and unless someone brings me evidence of professional misconduct, this stops here. I trust my staff. If you don't, you are welcome to withdraw your children from the program. The message was unambiguous. If someone wanted to make more of this, they could go to the board, but Franklin would not allow it to go unchallenged. Rachel smiled and nodded her understanding, but it didn't reach her eyes. By the end of the meeting, she was gone without having spoken a single word again. Clara walked out into the cool night air alone, her heart full. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the pavement. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders felt light. Hey! Clara turned. Daniel stood a few feet away, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding a folded note. I thought you might like to know, he said, offering it to her. Clara opened it. It was a printed copy of his email to the school, the one that had started the quiet tide turning, proving that he had intervened on her behalf. Clara read it in the lamplight, and when she looked up, her eyes were glossy. She could see his soft pride and steadiness, all for her. You did this, she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. No, they just needed permission to say what they already believed. You didn't have to, Clara tried to say, holding the paper to her breast, but Daniel didn't let her complete the thought. I did, he said. Because you mattered to Sophie long before you mattered to me. And now? Clara asked, the smile coming freely to her lips. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, just enough to break the space, but not the boundary. Now, he said, you matter to both of us. Clara swallowed hard. We still have a few months. I know. We have to be careful. I know that too. Daniel brushed a stray hair from her cheek, a touch that didn't linger but meant more than if he had cupped her cheek and kissed her. Then he stepped back again. I'm not in a rush, he said. But I'm not uncertain either. Clara's reply was soft. Good. The wind picked up around them, quiet and clean. The understanding between them was not loud or public. It was just the truth, spoken plainly between two people who'd earned it. Spring settled over the town like a sigh of relief. There were no more complaints, no whispered accusations, no impromptu meetings with folded arms and narrowed eyes. Rachel still lingered in the PTA, but her influence had frayed at the edges, smoothed by silence, then clipped clean by time. Vanessa didn't return for open house and remained absent from conferences. Even the end-of-year slideshow, where every child's photo rotated across the screen with music just a little too sentimental, saw Daniel in attendance, and not Vanessa. Clara moved through the last weeks of school with her usual grace, sharp where she needed to be, soft everywhere else. The kids adored her, the staff respected her, and even the cafeteria staff saved her extra applesauce on Fridays. And Daniel? He stayed steady, never intrusive, but always there in quiet support. Drop-offs became warmer. Pickups lingered longer. Sophie began leaving her drawings on Clara's desk without being prompted. Sometimes, she'd hug her goodbye. Once, when no one was near, she looped her arms around Clara's waist, pressed her face into her sweater, and whispered, "I love you, Mom." Clara didn't correct her, but she didn't cry either. The feelings of love and belonging nearly overwhelmed her as she held Sophie until the bell rang. The final day came with the usual chaos of autograph books, melted cupcakes, forgotten jackets, and half-torn posters pulled from the walls. Kids filed out with sunburns already blooming, and plans for camp and cousins and sleepovers. Clara closed the classroom door behind the last student and let the quiet settle in. 15 minutes later, she was still sitting on the edge of her desk when a soft knock came. Daniel. He stood in the doorway, one hand tucked in his pocket, the other holding a small envelope. "Sophie asked me to give this to you," he said. Clara opened it, revealing a drawing inside. It was a riotous mixture of crayon lines and watercolor swirls, revealing a garden and three figures holding hands beneath a tree. One of them wore glasses, one had red flowers in her hair, and the smallest figure had a crown and a speech bubble. "Best day ever." Beneath it, in careful block letters, "Me, Dad, Miss Hayes." Clara smiled. It wasn't wide or flashy, just honest. "She's proud of us," Daniel said quietly. "She doesn't have the words yet, but I think she knows that what we have matters." Clara folded the drawing and held it to her chest. "What do we have, Daniel?" He looked at her for a long moment, no longer cautious. It was the look of a man who knew what he wanted, had waited to say it, and reveled in the moment that had finally come. "I want a life that includes you," he said, "if it's still possible." Clara didn't hesitate. It always was. She stepped toward him, her hand finding his. We just had to be brave enough. The summer stretched wide in front of them, teasing possibilities, unwritten and undecided, but full of light. The summer came with slow mornings and second helpings. There were no backpacks, no schedules, and no whispered gossip in crowded hallways. Clara still woke early. Habits die hard, but the rhythm of her days shifted. They were softer, a delicate dance of love and growing certainty. Clara spent most days with Daniel and Sophie. Daniel had added a swing to the back porch. Clara added a wind chime. Sophie painted both. They took walks to the farmer's market on Saturdays, strolling through the produce and displays like they had all the time in the world. On weeknights, they indulged in popsicles and books before bed, all three curled together on the couch like a family that had always known how. And on the rare evening when Daniel and Clara slipped away alone, Melissa declared herself chief babysitter in charge. They rediscovered the sweet, private quiet of adult affection. Those nights consisted of laughter in parked cars, dinners, ice cream shared in the dark, and fingers interlaced across center consoles. Clara never asked where it was all going. She didn't have to. The wedding came the following spring, almost a full year from the day Sophie first sat, silent and skeptical, at a desk in Clara's classroom. Now she stood proudly at the edge of the aisle, holding both a satin pillow and a basket of petals, grinning in a dress with too many ruffles and a flower crown askew on her head. She tossed marigolds and baby's breath with dramatic flair, to the laughter of the guests and Clara's soft tears. Daniel waited at the altar, not nervous, but with a fullness in his heart like it might burst if he moved wrong. They married in a small outdoor ceremony under a canopy of twinkle lights and blush-colored tulle. Clara wore soft ivory, simple and elegant. Melissa cried unabashed tears. A few parents from school came, and Franklin even sent a note. Rachel, notably, did not. Vanessa, to the surprise of them both, graced the wedding venue with her usual flair. Daniel saw her arrive, late, naturally, clinging to the arm of a man who looked barely out of grad school. The man on her arm wore sunglasses, a tailored suit, and oozed performative boredom. He didn't smile once. Vanessa, of course, did enough smiling for both. She didn't cause a scene. She just watched, making her presence known. Daniel couldn't even detect a hint of regret for what she had thrown away. Perhaps in Vanessa's mind, she had gotten the better end of the deal with her husband's wealth and her life that included dalliances with unmarried guys a decade younger. When the dancing started, Daniel approached her, his protective instinct aroused. They spoke quietly at the edge of the dance floor, far enough not to be heard, but close enough to be seen. I guess you're happy, Vanessa said. Daniel nodded. I am. She raised one brow, smirking. In love, huh? It's not a guess. That wiped the smirk off her face. Daniel didn't press, but he added, You're always welcome to visit Sophie. But next time, maybe leave the accessory at home. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped, looked at him, and shrugged. Vanessa disappeared before they cut the cake. Back home, weeks later, they broke ground on the garden. Daniel drew the layout, ordered, balanced. Sophie insisted on signs. Carrots here, and tomatoes, beware. She painted marigolds on every one. Clara knelt in the soil, hands dirty, knees sore, and smiled through all of it. One morning, while watering the rose, Daniel stepped behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Do you want more? He asked softly. She turned to him. More? Kids, noise, crayons everywhere, another swing in the yard. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. Ask me again in September. Daniel laughed, low and warm. Sophie ran past them then, chasing a butterfly with a jar and no lid, her laughter rising above the morning breeze. Clara looked at the marigolds, bright, imperfect, blooming despite everything, and thought yes, yes to all of it. That night, as the porch light clicked on and the garden settled into shadow, Clara wrote a note in the back of her old journal. Sometimes you don't cross a line. You grow something beside it. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like everything was exactly where it belonged.
Original heartwarming fiction every week. Subscribe for your next great story.